May 4th, 1970, Kent State University. A moment that would change the course of American history. Amidst the chaos, one image would forever be etched in the nation's collective memory. A 14-year-old runaway kneeling over the body of Jeffrey Miller, a Kent State student shot by National Guardsmen. Today, the story behind the iconic photograph of Mary Ann Vecchio, the girl who screamed in horror, and the events that led her to that fateful moment. Alan Canfora, a young man with a passion for justice and a desire to make his voice heard, walked across campus, caught in the crossfire of a confrontation between National Guardsmen and protesters. A bullet ripped through his wrist, leaving him wounded, and forever changed the course of his life. My name is Brian Smith, and welcome to the story behind the story. Mary Ann Vecchio has granted very few interviews in the 55 years since Kent State. Before Kent State, she was a free spirit. I was the kid rolling down the river on a raft, she recalls. In my childhood, I believed anything was possible. But her home in Opa-locka, Florida, not far from Miami, could be volatile. When her parents fought, she and her brothers and sisters would scatter, with Mary Ann hiding out in spots as far away as Miami Beach, some 15 miles from her home. Soon she got in trouble, smoking pot, skipping school. So in February 1970, when the police told Mary Ann, then 14, that they'd throw her in jail if they caught her playing hooky one more time, she took off, in her bare feet. She says she wasn't rebelling against her parents' authority or seeking to join the anti-war movement. She said, "I just wanted to be anywhere that wasn't Opa-locka, Florida." Hitchhiking her way across the country, Mary Ann slept in fields, crash pads, working here and there for money for food, seeing the country, meeting new people, sharing music. The adventure had that feeling of magic from her childhood. Until she got to Kent State in northern Ohio, where on May 4th, student protests erupted over President Richard Nixon's decision to invade Cambodia. Mary Ann, in her jeans, white scarf, and a pair of hippie sandals someone had given her, headed toward a field where students were gathered. On her way to join the protest, she struck up a conversation with a guy in bell-bottoms. The two of them watched as another student waved a black flag taunting the National Guard troops who had been sent in after protesters had burned down the ROTC building 2 nights earlier. The soldiers seemed to retreat to a nearby hill. Then, in the next 13 seconds, they fired more than 60 shots. Mary Ann dropped to the pavement and waited until the smoke had cleared to look up. Jeffrey Miller, the student she'd been talking to, was face down on the ground. She knelt over his body as blood seeped onto the pavement. Other students walked by, too stunned or confused to look. "Doesn't anyone see what just happened here?" she remembers crying. "Why is no one helping him?" As the soldiers approached, their guns at the ready, she recalls asking them a question that countless others across the country would soon ask as well. "Why did you do this?" Nearby were more bodies. Allison Krause was shot in the chest, William Schroeder in the back. Sandy Schuer, who was just passing through the area on her way to class, was struck by a bullet that hit her jugular vein. 4 dead in Ohio. John Philo was a senior at Kent State in May 1970, a student photographer who almost missed out on covering the protests. All other photographers on the student paper had assignments, so John, then 21, was working in the newspaper office to help process their pictures. On his lunch break, he grabbed a camera and stepped outside. He went straight toward the action, where a student in the no man's land between soldiers and students waved a black flag. John snapped the photo thinking, "Okay, I've got my picture." A moment later, the soldiers formed a rifle line. I put my camera to my eye and trained it on one of the soldiers, he says. He aimed towards me and then his gun goes off. The next thing I know, a bullet hits a tree next to me and a chunk of bark flew off. John Philo dropped to the ground and waited out the 13 seconds of gunfire. When the smoke cleared, he stood and patted his arms and legs, checking to see if he'd been hit. Then, not 10 feet away, he saw a body on the ground. John was running out of film as he saw a girl kneel beside the body. I knew the boy was dead, but I could tell she didn't know. I could see something building in her, and all of a sudden she lets out this scream, and I shoot one more picture. Now I'm out of film. By the time he reloaded his camera, the girl was gone. Alan Canfora arrived at Kent State in the fall of 1968, and he immediately immersed himself in student activism. As a member of Kent State's branch of the Students for a Democratic Society, he was among the 300 students protesting May 4, 1970. He had already been a veteran protester. He and other Students for a Democratic Society disrupted Richard Nixon at a campaign rally in Akron in 1968. Canfora originally supported U.S. involvement in Vietnam as a youngster in Barberton. His father was a city councilman there and had been a United Auto Workers local vice president. But one of his friends came home in a body bag in April of 1970. On the morning of May 4th, Kent State students were mostly focused on the presence of gunmen who had taken over the campus and who had broken up a student rally that day at noon. Canfora was a junior majoring in pre-law. He was one of the most noticeable and provocative of the protesters, waving a large black flag in front of the soldiers wherever they marched. When the guardsmen appeared to be retreating to the commons, Canfora followed behind. He was 75 yards away when the troops suddenly turned and fired, mostly in his direction. Canfora was hit in the wrist and dove behind a tree that was blistered with more bullets. Next to him was his roommate, Tom Grace, who was knocked to the ground when a bullet struck his ankle. 40 feet behind them, Jeffrey Miller lay dying after being shot in the throat. A Portage County grand jury handed down indictments after the shootings, not against guardsmen, but against the students. Canfora became known as one of the Kent 25. Over time, the charges were dropped, and criminal and civil cases were brought against the soldiers who fired on the students. The plaintiffs eventually won a $600,000 settlement with the Ohio National Guard, most of the money going to Dean Kaler, a student who was paralyzed after being shot in the back. Canfora, Kaler, and other students did not put the killings behind them. They created the May 4th Task Force to educate future students at the campus about the events that spanned the first 4 days of May 1970. In 1977, Camphora, Kent students, and supporters held rallies and sit-ins on an area near the shootings where the university wanted to build a gymnasium annex. Protesters who created a tent city at the site argued that the new building would change the perspective on land they considered sacred ground. Camphora continued to demand the school build a memorial to the slain students. At the time, one small stone with the names of the 4 dead was the only marker at the parking lot where most of the students fell and died. Kent State University suffered a drop-off in enrollment after the shootings, and officials largely wanted to put the killings behind them. In the 1980s, Kent State was calling itself simply Kent, and the words State University were reduced in its logos and stationery. But Camphora remained active with each new class of students. Each year on May 4th, a ceremony was held at noon on the campus commons. To this day, the victory bell is rung in honor of the students who were killed or wounded. These annual ceremonies are organized not by the school, but by the May 4th task force that Camphora helped form. As new Kent State administrations changed, so did their attitude about the history made on May 4th, 1970. In 1990, Camphora got his wish when the school dedicated a memorial near Taylor Hall at the top of a hill overlooking the commons. Camphora continued to lobby until the school added the names of the wounded students to the memorial, and in 1999 built barriers around the 4 spaces where the slain students had died in the Taylor Hall parking lot. By 2010, the university opened the May 4th Visitors Center, a museum in Taylor Hall near the site of the shootings. And in 2016, a 17-acre parcel of land where the events took place was named a National Historic Landmark. The images of May 4th, 1970 shocked our collective conscience and insisted that we look. We eventually looked away, unaware or perhaps unwilling to think about the suffering that went on long after the shutter was snapped, or of the cost to the human beings trapped inside those photos. The young girl who was 14 on May 4th, 1970, Marianne Vecchio, said, "That picture of me hijacked my life." She is now 65 years old. She said, 50 years later, I still haven't really moved on. That afternoon in 1970, the world was riveted by an image that showed the life draining out of a young man on the ground. There was no more riveting image than the black and white still photo of Marianne Vecchio, the center of that photo, her arms raised in anguish, begging for help. That photo of her kneeling over the body of Kent State University student Jeffrey Miller is one of the most important images of the 20th century. That iconic picture, taken by a student photographer with the last roll of film in his camera, John Philo, captures Marianne's raw grief and disbelief at the realization that the nation's soldiers had just fired at its own children. Marianne Vecchio, looking back, said she didn't know anyone at Kent State. She was there by chance, and she only knew Jeffrey Miller for about 25 minutes. Taking orders from the National Guard troops who were herding students onto a bus, she followed in a daze. Some 2 hours later, when the bus arrived in Columbus, Ohio, the soldiers told everyone to get off. Many of the students ran to waiting parents. Marianne stumbled around the streets of the city. She'd never even heard of Columbus. The days after the shooting went by in a haze for Marianne. She hitchhiked out of Columbus, drifting west and sleeping wherever she could. She had heard she was wanted by the FBI, so she didn't tell anyone who she was. She wound up crashing on a pad in Indianapolis, thinking that if she could just get to California, she could start her life over again. But a kid at the house where she was staying recognized her and tipped off a reporter from the Indianapolis Star. Marianne, barely disguised in fake glasses, talked to the reporter, hoping he'd give her bus fare to California in exchange for her story. But that reporter got his scoop, then called authorities, who put her in juvenile detention as a runaway. I would have stayed anonymous forever, she says, but that guy from the Indianapolis Star, he knocked out my future. Within days, she was back home in Florida. Many people refuse to believe the nearly 6-foot-tall girl with the long flowing hair and the mournful face was only 14 years old. Her family received calls and letters calling her a drug addict and a communist. The governor said she was part of a nationally organized conspiracy of professional agitators that was responsible for the student's death. While some people saw her as a symbol of the national conscience, some Kent State students expressed resentment about her fame, saying she wasn't even a protester. Back in Kent, Ohio, business owners ran an ad thanking the National Guard. Mail poured into the mayor's office, blaming dirty hippies, long hairs, and outside agitators for the violence. Some Kent residents raised 4 fingers when they passed each other in the street, a silent signal that meant, at least we got 4 of them. President Nixon issued a statement saying that the students' action had invited the tragedy. Privately, he called them bums. And a Gallup poll found that 58% of Americans blamed the students for their own deaths, and only 11% blamed the National Guard. Back in Florida, Marianne Vecchio couldn't even go out for a hamburger without reporters and hecklers following her. Death threats filled the Vecchio family mailbox. It's too bad it wasn't you that was shot. What you need is a good beating until you bleed red. Other letters said, I hope you enjoyed sleeping with all those dope fiends. The depths of the Kent State 4 lies at the conscience of yourself. And on the letters went. At 14, she was a human flashpoint, her face on magazine covers, posters, and handbills. The humor magazine National Lampoon ran a fake ad for a Kent State playset complete with toy soldiers, protesters, and one kneeling student. And not that long ago, a satirical news story calling a loss by the Kent State basketball team a massacre. Marianne's face was photoshopped onto the body of a cheerleader kneeling over a fallen basketball player. Amazingly, her father sold t-shirts with Marianne's grieving image on the front. She even signed some of the shirts. Still in a state of shock, she said. People thought we were getting rich, but we never had any money. It sounds bad, but my dad did what he did for me. He was taking care of me in the only way he knew how. What the traumatized teenager didn't get was counseling. It never even occurred to her. She eventually ran away from home again and got caught, ending up in juvenile detention. She ran away from there too, was caught again, and returned. She recalls the police followed her incessantly, arresting her for loitering, for smoking pot. I was a mess, like I was trying to punch my way out of a paper bag. Later in 1977, Marianne was profiled by 60 Minutes as a maladjusted kid. Morley Safer said she wasn't a symbol of the tragedy of the Vietnam War. She wasn't a symbol of anything. Just a 14-year-old nobody hitchhiking from nowhere to nowhere. John Filo's picture would win a Pulitzer Prize. His photo, Time magazine said, captured the sense that the Vietnam War had come home. But he too was haunted. I felt very guilty, he says. At arm's length to my right, a guy was shot. At arm's length to my left, that's where Jeffrey Miller was killed. I'm alive and I'm relatively famous, and they're dead. And when he read that the police had been harassing Marianne, he felt responsible. Eventually, at age 22, Marianne took off from Florida, moved to Las Vegas, and married and got a job in a casino coffee shop. She was rarely mentioned in news stories commemorating the events of May 4th, 1970. John Filo went on to have a successful career as a photographer. Today, he is the head of photography for CBS. He says not a day goes by he doesn't think about the Kent State students or about Marianne Vecchio. Sometimes he even has nightmares about her. A professor at Emerson College and the author of Mayday, Kent State, Gregory Payne, had an idea that he thought might help Filo and Vecchio. In 1995, he organized a 25-year retrospective on Kent State. He invited both Marianne and John to attend. Marianne was open to the idea. John eventually agreed, but he said he dreaded ever meeting Marianne again. He did accept the invitation, but didn't do so until the last minute. And even though they had never officially met before, Marianne said that she and John had the instant bond of a pair of old Army buddies. Kent State had haunted them both from opposite ends of the lens. Later that day, as Marianne spoke to the assembled group about the trauma of the Kent State shootings, John had an epiphany about the power of his photo. It was because she was 14, because of her youth, that she ran to help, that she ran to do something. There were other people 18, 19, 20 years old who didn't get close to the body. She did. She was a kid reacting to the horror in front of her. Had she not been 14, the picture would not have happened. Today, it's hard to look at that photo of Kent State and Marianne Vecchio kneeling down over Jeffrey Miller and to see a 14-year-old girl unaware of how that single moment shaped her entire life. She's now the subject of a photo known the world over, but never really known as a person. John Filo, Marianne Vecchio, and Alan Canfora. That's the story behind the story of May 4th, 1970, the Kent State shootings. I hope you found this story as fascinating as I did. My name is Brian Smith, and we are history. Thank you for listening.